Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are three fundamental points to be made about the bill before us, and I will do so more briefly than the previous speaker, although I'm delighted to follow her. The first is there is a constitutional issue at the heart of this legislation, and it is this. It is about the power of this House, of this Parliament, and the power of the executive. This bill creates a permissive power for the executive to introduce, by regulation, through statutory instrument, all kinds of measures. Now, those who have been in this House for a long time, and those of us who have been in the House for a rather shorter time perhaps too, will know what that means in practice. It means a brief debate in a room upstairs, which will take minutes, perhaps a few minutes, perhaps a little longer. It will be thinly populated, and the measure will be given scant scrutiny. What should happen is the executive should be held to account on the floor of this House or by a committee designed for the purpose, which brings me to my second point about this bill. We once had a European Scrutiny Committee. The task of that committee was to look closely at all kinds of things which emanated from the European Union. And the Honourable Lady who spoke immediately before me described those of us in this House who are sceptical about the European Union as not being rational. She said these were irrational fears about the European Union. Were that to be true, she would probably have a point. But actually our fears are entirely rational ones, because we know what emanated from the European Union during our membership, and it was endless bureaucracy, often gold-plated here, I acknowledge, but nonetheless every kind of rule and regulation, some of which were entirely superfluous to our needs because they were introduced on a pan-European basis. I learned long ago that power is best exercised when it's exercised closest to its effect. When decisions are made, they need to be sensitive to the difference they make to those affected by them. And one of the reasons that I was a passionate supporter of Brexit is because I want power to return to its effect, to the place where it has its effect. And I fear, therefore, entirely rationally, that if the default position as a result of this bill is that we end up with European regulation, it won't be sensitive to its effect. It will be decided upon far from where the businesses that it affects are located. So the second issue here is about how this measure is scrutinised. And I invite the government to perhaps reinvent some kind of European Scrutiny Committee or something similar. Perhaps you call it a regulatory scrutiny committee. Perhaps it will be a body that allowed the full consideration of each of the measures that the government introduced under this bill, this umbrella bill, to ensure the House was happy with them, felt they were appropriate, felt they'd been tailored in the right way. Perhaps that might be an amendment that the government accepts during the passage of this legislation, given the Secretary of State said he was open-minded to improve the legislation during its passage. The third problem that this bill has at its heart is the assumption that harmonisation, that's the term that's often used, and one should always be terribly fearful when one hears that word, because it's usually not about creating harmony, but about accepting control from elsewhere, that process will snuff out some of the measures that might more usefully be adopted by government and will impose on businesses and others blunt measures which are insensitive to the particularities that prevail in our country. And I do worry about that. I don't say that it's with intent. It seemed to me the Secretary of State made clear it wasn't his intention that should happen, but I just fear that it will. And the regulatory impact assessment of this bill we have the explanatory notes already, kind of imply that. They said that they say, and the Secretary of State repeated it in his opening remarks, that there are all kinds of changes happening at a pace that require the attention of government, new rules, new regulations, new restrictions, and that pace is so great that it's hard for the government to keep up. And my fear is, therefore, that they will adopt very broad measures rather than ones which are sufficiently tailored, sufficiently refined to meet domestic needs. So with that constitutional problem of the balance between the executive and parliament, with that lack of scrutiny and oversight, which comes from not having a body which can look at these things on a one-by-one basis, and with that tendency to produce broad-brush measures emanating from the European Union, as implied both on the face of this bill and supporting documents, I have grave doubts about this legislation. It's true that we should regulate where necessary. Of course, that's right. It's right in the public interest we do so. But we must always do so with care, because when that regulation becomes burdensome, when it frustrates innovation, when it tempers the ability to produce goods which meet popular demand, rather than becoming helpful to either customers or those that supply them, it inhibits the very things which support those businesses and aid those customers. And I simply invite the Minister, when he sums up, to re-emphasise that the government believes, as I do, in light-touch regulation, in regulation which only applies when there's been appropriate discussion with those affected by it, that there will be a proper dialogue between business and business representatives before new measures are introduced, and that all that's introduced will have the character that I set out, be tailored and specific, and in the British interest. For our role in this place, if it is anything, is to defend the national interest. I know there's a kind of heady internationalism which permeates particular parts of this chamber, and I look to my left towards the Liberal Democrats. There they are. But I've always thought it was more important to stand up for the British people, to represent my constituents to the best of my ability, to be, as I described earlier, sensitive to the particularities of the locale that I represent and the country which I love. Is that too much to ask of members of this House? So I don't regard my fears about this bill, contrary to the Honourable Lady's assertion, as irrational. I think they're deeply rooted in a rational fear of the worst this bill could bring.